Ancient harbors were never meant to stay in one place. We picture them as grand, permanent stone structures, but the truth is far more restless. These vital hubs of trade and culture were constantly on the move, fleeing from the very forces that first created them. This journey explores the powerful geological and human pressures that forced these ports to relocate, revealing why their abandoned ruins are not just forgotten stones, but unique archives of our planet's history. By the end, you will understand how to read the story of civilization written in silt and submerged stone. We will see how a thriving port can be slowly choked by its own river, or suddenly drowned by a sinking coast. What do these silent ruins say about our own struggle to build on a changing Earth? A harbor was not a dock. It was a living, breathing system. Think of it as a single, vital organ in the body of a civilization, an intricate interface where the pulse of the sea met the steady rhythm of the land. For it to function, three essential elements had to align perfectly, like a delicate lock and key. First, you needed a protected anchorage, a natural shield of land or a man-made breakwater to calm the fury of the open sea and give merchant ships a safe place to rest. Second, a reliable source of fresh water was non-negotiable. A city of sailors, traders, and dockworkers could not survive on salt water alone. And third, the harbor had to be connected to a rich hinterland, a network of roads and rivers that could funnel goods inland and draw wealth back to the coast. This was the golden balance, but this balance existed on a knife's edge. The very forces that created a perfect natural harbor, like a river depositing silt to form a sheltered bay, were the same forces destined to destroy it. That river would keep bringing silt year after year, slowly filling the bay it made. The land itself might sink or the sea might rise. The harbor was never a finished monument. It was a temporary agreement with nature, a deal that was always being renegotiated by the tides, the rivers, and the shifting earth beneath it. Relocation was not a sign of failure, but a stark admission of this truth. It was the system trying to stay alive. Of all the forces that reshaped these ancient shores, one was the most patient and the most relentless. It was not a sudden earthquake or a violent storm, but a quiet, constant whisper carried by every river. This was the process of siltation, the slow-motion burial of a harbor under its own lifeblood. The very rivers that gave these ports their purpose, connecting them to inland empires and bringing fresh water to thirsty cities, were also delivering their sentence. With every flood, every seasonal rush of water, these rivers carried millions of tiny particles of eroded rock and soil from mountains far away. Think of it as a geological conveyor belt running for centuries without pause. Where the river met the calm of the sea, it would finally drop its burden. The heaviest sand and gravel settled first, often right at the river's mouth, building a bar that could block larger ships. The finer silt and clay drifted further, settling like a soft, persistent snow across the harbor floor. Year after year, this layer grew thicker. The water became shallower. What was once a deep basin for trireme warships might, in a few generations, become a muddy flat only suitable for small fishing boats. This is how a harbor was gently, inexorably suffocated. The most dramatic examples of this are the great river deltas like those of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Meander in Turkey. Here, the process has a specific name: progradation. It describes the coastline itself marching forward into the sea as new land is built from all that deposited sediment. A port built at the river's mouth during the time of the pharaohs might find itself 500 years later stranded a mile or more inland, separated from the open water by a new plain of fertile soil. The harbor wasn't destroyed by a catastrophe. It was simply left behind by the very landscape it depended on. The water had receded, and the city now stood high and dry, a monument to a shoreline that no longer existed. This silent, incremental change forced some of the most significant urban relocations in history. A city's entire reason for being, its connection to the wider world, was slowly cut off. The response was not to fight the river, an impossible task with ancient technology, but to follow the water, to pack up the essence of the port, its knowledge, its people, and its trade networks, and rebuild where the deep water began again. Each abandoned harbor site became a time capsule, buried not by invaders but by the land itself. The story of Ephesus is the story of a river's quiet betrayal. Once, this was one of the greatest port cities of the ancient world, a glittering gateway where the wealth of Asia met the ambitions of Rome. Its harbor on the Aegean coast was deep and sheltered, a perfect cradle for maritime power. For centuries, the Cayster River was its faithful partner, bringing fresh water down from the mountains and connecting the city to a rich agricultural hinterland. But with every gift of water, the Cayster brought a curse of silt. This was not a sudden disaster, but a slow, geological inevitability playing out over more than 1,000 years. Each flood season deposited another layer of fine sediment into the harbor basin. The water grew shallower, the navigable channel narrower. You can almost picture the city's engineers and rulers watching this gradual change with growing dread, generation after generation. Their first response was one of brilliant, determined adaptation. They dug. The historical record tells us of massive canal projects, attempts to dredge the accumulating muck and maintain a clear passage to the sea. For a while it worked. Ephesus fought back, using immense human labor to hold the line against nature's patient advance, but the Cayster never stopped. It was a force that could not be bargained with or permanently subdued. By the late Roman period, the struggle was turning. The canals would silt up almost as fast as they could be cleared. The great seagoing ships that once docked at the city's wharves now had to anchor further and further away, their cargo transferred to smaller, lighter boats. The direct, deep water connection that made Ephesus a metropolis was fading. Then it was gone. By the early centuries of the second millennium, the process was complete. The harbor had transformed into a malarial marsh and then, finally, into solid, dry land. The magnificent city, with its legendary temple of Artemis, its vast theater, and its bustling agora, was left stranded. The coastline had marched westward, leaving Ephesus imprisoned by its own fertile plain, a stunning 2.5 miles from the open sea. Today, when visitors walk among those majestic ruins, they are standing in what was once a thriving port. The silence they hear is not just the absence of people, but the absence of waves. The Cayster River won its long war, and in doing so, it created one of archaeology's most poignant monuments, a powerful testament to the impermanence of even our grandest constructions upon a shifting earth. But silt was only one side of the story. While some ports were being pushed away from the sea by new land, others were being pulled under it. This was the opposite geological nightmare, where the water came to claim what was built on the shore. Here, the enemy was not accumulation but absence. The ground itself began to sink, or the sea began to rise, or both happened at once in a slow, relentless embrace that drowned stone and memory. This process, coastal subsidence, turned thriving waterfronts into ghostly underwater landscapes. Unlike the gradual silting of a river delta, which gave cities time to plan a retreat, subsidence could be a more insidious thief. It often worked in subtle increments, barely noticeable within a single human lifetime. A quay that once stood a comfortable foot above the highest winter tide might, over a century, find itself lapped by seawater on a calm day. Warehouses built to store grain and cloth would become damp, then flooded, their floors slowly surrendering to rising damp and rot. The very foundations of the port, the massive stone blocks laid with such confidence, would begin to settle unevenly into the soft, waterlogged sediments beneath them. What caused the land to give way? The reasons are written deep in the Earth's restless nature. In some regions, it was the immense weight of the city itself, pressing down on soft delta soils and compacting them over centuries. In others, it was the powerful forces of plate tectonics, where one section of the Earth's crust slowly slides beneath another, causing the overlying land to tilt and sink. There is also a slower, grander rhythm known as isostatic adjustment. Think of the Earth's crust as a giant, floating raft on a denser layer beneath. If a great weight, like a massive ice sheet, presses down on one area for thousands of years, the raft sinks there. When that ice finally melts, the depressed area begins to rise back up very slowly, like a memory foam mattress regaining its shape. But this rebound in one place can cause a compensatory sinking in surrounding regions. All of these forces contribute to what scientists call relative sea level change. This is the critical, local reality for any coastal settlement. It is not about the global average of ocean height, but the changing level between the sea and the specific piece of land you are standing on. If your land sinks just 2 millimeters a year and the global sea level rises another 2, your relative sea level is climbing 4 millimeters annually. Over 500 years, that is a difference of 2 full meters, more than enough to drown an entire port district. This is why you find the ruins of Roman fish tanks, their carefully engineered sluice gates now deep underwater off the coast of Italy. Or why medieval harbors in the North Sea now lie submerged beneath the waves. The sea did not necessarily rise with a sudden cataclysm. Often, the land simply and quietly withdrew its support, inch by patient inch, until the waves finally took back what they had once yielded. The Roman Empire understood the power of a stable coastline better than any civilization before it. To feed the million souls of Rome, they needed a harbor that defied the whims of nature, a permanent gateway for the grain ships from Egypt and Africa. Their answer was Portus, an artificial harbor of staggering ambition built first by Emperor Claudius and then massively expanded by Trajan just a short distance from the older port of Ostia. This was not a natural haven improved by human hands. It was a masterpiece of engineering carved from the marshy Italian coast. Claudius's engineers dug out a vast basin, protected by 2 curving concrete breakwaters, and even sank a colossal ship filled with concrete to form a lighthouse foundation. Later, Trajan added an ingenious hexagonal inner basin, connected by canals to the Tiber River and the sea. Portus was meant to be eternal, the unchanging heart of Roman maritime supply. But the ground beneath it had other plans. Archaeologists and geologists studying the site today see a clear, sobering story written in stone and water. They find the heavy masonry of the ancient wharves and warehouses now submerged, sitting well below modern sea level. Even more telling are the adjustments made by the Romans themselves during construction. In some structures, you can see where builders had to add new steps or raise floor levels, not because of poor planning, but because the existing foundations had already sunk. They were building on layers of soft, water-saturated sediment, and the immense weight of their own stonework was pressing the land down. This is the signature of subsidence captured in mid-action. The Romans were not just building a port, they were engaged in a continuous, silent battle against a sinking landscape. Their engineering was a response to a problem they could measure in real time. They used ingenious techniques like driving wooden pilings deep into the mud to create a stable platform for their heavy walls, and constructing intricate networks of brick-lined drainage channels to keep the ground as dry as possible. For centuries, their skill held the line. Maintenance crews constantly dredged the basins and repaired settled walls. But like all such battles against geological forces, it was a war of attrition. After the empire's central authority faded, the systematic, costly maintenance stopped. The drainage channels clogged, the slow, steady sinking, compounded by a gradual rise in sea level, continued unchecked. The magnificent hexagonal basin, once bustling with ships, gradually transformed into a stagnant lagoon, then a malaria-ridden swamp, and finally was buried under silt. The sea and the soft earth reclaimed what the empire's will had briefly held at bay. Portus stands as a dual monument to both human brilliance and planetary patience. It shows us that even the mightiest constructions are negotiations with an unstable earth, and that the most enduring legacy of a harbor may be the layered record of its own slow surrender. Yet nature was not the only architect of these changes. Human hands, often with the best of intentions, became a powerful and unseen force accelerating the very processes that would doom their own cities. For every harbor that silted up, there was a story unfolding far upstream in the distant hills and forests that fed the rivers. The ancient world ran on wood. It was the fuel for forges and baths, the primary material for homes and furniture, and most critically, the essential resource for shipbuilding and construction. To build a single trireme, the warship of the classical Mediterranean, required the timber of over 2,000 mature trees. A merchant fleet demanded thousands more. And as cities grew, so did their hunger for cleared land to grow food. The result was a transformation of the landscape on a scale we are only now beginning to fully understand. Vast tracts of forest were cleared, their deep, tangled root systems that once held the soil firmly in place were ripped away. When the seasonal rains came, they now fell on exposed, vulnerable earth. Without the forest canopy to break the force of the droplets and the roots to absorb the water and bind the soil, the result was catastrophic erosion. Torrents of rainwater would now sweep topsoil directly into the river systems, carrying a vastly increased load of silt and clay on a direct course for the harbors below. This was a silent, unintended feedback loop of astonishing consequence. A city would cut down trees to build the ships that brought it wealth, or to plant the crops that fed its people. In doing so, it would unleash a wave of earth that would travel down river and slowly choke its own lifeline to the sea. The harbor's death sentence was not just written by geology, but signed by the axes and plows of the civilization it served. We see this starkly in the records of places like the Meander River Valley in Anatolia. Historical accounts describe a region once famed for its dense forests. By the Roman era, those forests were largely gone, converted to prosperous farmland. The river, now carrying the soil of those cleared slopes, accelerated its relentless advance of the coastline, stranding harbor after harbor. This is perhaps one of the earliest and most profound examples of human-induced environmental change, directly determining the fate of major urban centers. The people of the time likely did not connect the clearing of a distant forest to the gradual shallowing of their port. They were solving immediate, pressing needs for fuel, for food, for security. The environmental impact was a slow-motion crisis, invisible within a single lifetime but devastating across centuries. It reframes the fall of a harbor city. It was not always a sudden conquest by an enemy army, but sometimes a slow, self-inflicted isolation, a community inadvertently cutting its own anchor to the world. The ruins of these ports, therefore, are more than just monuments to natural change. They are archives of an ancient lesson, a testament to the profound and often unintended ways our survival can reshape the very ground we stand on and the waters we sail. Then there were the days when the earth did not move slowly but roared. For all the patient power of silt and subsidence, history also records moments of sudden, violent transformation that could rewrite a coastline in a single afternoon. An earthquake is a geological punctuation mark, a brutal full stop that ends one chapter of a harbor's story and forces an immediate, desperate beginning to the next. Unlike the creeping threat of shallow water, a seismic shock delivered its verdict without warning. the very basin of a harbor could be wrenched upward, lifted completely out of the water by the force of colliding tectonic plates. In an instant, a thriving port would find its docks and ships stranded on dry, cracked mud, its connection to the sea severed as if by a giant's hand. The opposite was just as catastrophic. A section of coast could drop several meters, swallowing the waterfront and inviting the sea to flood miles of low-lying city streets. These events did more than just change the water level. They could alter the very geography that made the harbor possible. A river, its course blocked by a landslide or shifted by a new fault line, might abandon its old channel entirely, redirecting its life-giving water and its silt to a new location miles away. Or out at sea, the sudden displacement of the ocean floor could generate a tsunami, a wall of water that would race toward the coast to deliver a different kind of burial. Instead of soft silt, a port could be scoured clean by the force of the waves or smothered under a thick layer of chaotic debris, rocks, and sand torn from the seabed. The archaeological record at sites like ancient Helike in Greece tells this stark tale. Historical sources describe a powerful quake one winter night in 373 BC. The city, a major maritime power, reportedly sank into a chasm that opened in the earth and then was covered by a tsunami from the nearby Corinthian Gulf. The area was lost for centuries, becoming little more than a legend. Modern research suggests a rapid subsidence of the entire coastal plain, followed by inundation. The disaster was so complete, so total, that the city was never rebuilt in the same place. Its people scattered, and its political influence vanished overnight. This is the ultimate contrast to the slow retreat from silt. An earthquake forced not a planned migration, but a frantic exodus. There was no time for engineering solutions or gradual relocation. The relationship with the sea was broken in a moment, and the choice was stark: abandon the site completely or perish. These seismic ruins, therefore, hold a different kind of story. They are not archives of a long negotiation, but snapshots of a single, terrible day. They remind us that for all our planning, the ground beneath our feet holds a volatile power, capable of reshaping human destiny in the time it takes to draw a single, startled breath. The slow creep of silt and the sudden jolt of an earthquake are two chapters in the same story. But to see them written together in one place, you must look to the coast of Egypt. The legendary city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, was a masterwork of human planning. Its architects chose a site protected by the island of Pharaohs, creating not one but two magnificent harbors. The western harbor served commerce, but the eastern harbor was the city's beating royal heart. This is where the Ptolemaic kings built their palaces, their temples, and their most opulent villas on a man-made island called Anterodos, meaning counter to Rhodes. It was a district of marble and granite, of sweeping colonnades and private docks for the royal fleet, a symbol of power meant to last for eternity. For centuries it did, but the ground beneath this splendor held a secret instability. Alexandria sits at a nexus of tectonic tension, where the African plate meets a complex system of faults. Beginning in the 4th century after the Common Era, a series of powerful earthquakes struck the region. These were not isolated events, but part of a prolonged period of seismic unrest that culminated in another devastating quake in the 8th century. The shaking alone would have been catastrophic, toppling columns and shattering walls, but the true transformation was more gradual and more complete. The seismic energy released along these faults triggered a process of liquefaction and subsidence in the soft sediments of the coastline. Think of the ground not as solid rock, but as a wet sponge. A violent shake compresses it, squeezing the water out and causing everything on the surface to settle downward. The royal quarter, built on reclaimed land and artificial islands, was uniquely vulnerable. Piece by piece, section by section, the magnificent structures of the eastern harbor began to sink. The sea, which had been held at bay by mighty walls, now found a way in. It did not rush in like a tsunami, but advanced steadily, silently, over decades. A palace floor would grow damp, then flood at high tide. A courtyard would become a tidal pool. Eventually, entire complexes slipped beneath the waves, swallowed by the very water they were designed to command. The island of Anchorages, the jewel of the harbor, vanished completely from view. For over 1,000 years, the royal city existed only in historical texts and fading maps, a ghost beneath the turquoise Mediterranean. Then, in the 1990s, underwater archaeologists began to map the harbor floor. What they found was a time capsule of breathtaking clarity, preserved by the very seawater that buried it. They mapped grand avenues lined with sphinxes, the foundations of the royal palace, toppled columns and statues of gods and rulers, even the remains of a ceremonial barge. This submerged landscape is now an underwater archaeological park, a silent, aqueous museum. The ruins of Alexandria's eastern harbor tell a layered story. They show us the sudden violence of the quakes that initiated the collapse, visible in the chaotic fall of massive stone blocks. But they also record the slower, inexorable subsidence that followed, the patient drowning of a district. It is a powerful reminder that even the most calculated human grandeur is subject to the deep, restless movements of the planet. The water that now covers these stones is not just a grave, but a preservative, holding the memory of a royal world in suspended animation, waiting for us to read its sunken script. Yet the ground beneath a harbor was not the only thing that could shift. An even more unpredictable force could drain its lifeblood while leaving its stones perfectly intact, the flow of wealth and power. A port could be abandoned not because its water was too shallow, but because the world's attention had simply moved elsewhere. This was death by economic obsolescence, a quiet fading where the docks fell silent long before they crumbled into the sea. The fate of a harbor was always tied to the map of human ambition, and when that map was redrawn by war, politics, or new technology, even the finest port could become a ghost town. Consider the ancient Silk Road, that legendary network of caravan trails connecting China to the Mediterranean. For centuries, its western terminus was the prosperous city of Palmyra, in what is now Syria. Goods from the east, silks and spices, would arrive there by camel train. They were then loaded onto ships at nearby ports like Sidon or Tyre, which thrived as the crucial maritime gateways. But when the Roman Empire secured direct sea routes to India and the Red Sea in the 1st century, the calculus changed. Why haul goods overland across thousands of miles of desert when a ship could sail directly from the Indian Ocean to Roman Egypt? The overland Silk Road through Palmyra remained important, but its dominance waned. The ports that served it were no longer the only, or even the best, option. Their strategic monopoly was broken, and with it, a portion of their economic reason for being. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual diversion of the river of trade. A more decisive shift came with the rise of new naval technologies. For millennia, Mediterranean shipping relied on oar and sail, hugging coastlines and seeking safe harbor every night. This made a dense network of small, sheltered coves essential. But the development of the full-rigged ship in the age of exploration changed everything. These larger, sturdier vessels, capable of carrying immense cargo and sailing for weeks across open ocean, no longer needed to hop from one small port to the next. They could sail directly from major producer to major consumer. Overnight, countless small harbors that had serviced the coastal trade for centuries found themselves bypassed. Their perfect geography was now irrelevant. The economic current had simply flowed into a deeper, wider channel, leaving them stranded like oxbow lakes cut off from a river. Perhaps the most profound economic trigger, however, was the changing nature of the cargo itself. A harbor built to handle one kind of wealth could be rendered useless by the next. The great medieval ports of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic, like Lübeck and Visby, were built on the trade of bulk goods, timber, grain, and salted herring. Their harbors were functional, built for cogs and keels, but when the economic center of gravity shifted towards the Atlantic and the trade in spices, silks, and later colonial goods, these northern ports faced a double challenge. Not only were the new trade routes physically distant, but the new luxury goods required different infrastructure, deeper harbors for larger ships, and different commercial networks. Power and capital migrated to new cities like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London, which invested in the facilities to match the new economy. The Hanseatic ports, though still physically usable, slowly faded from the center of the world stage. Their decline was a story not of silt or quakes, but of economic irrelevance. They were perfectly good harbors for a world that no longer existed. This reveals a poignant truth about these ancient sites. Their ruins tell us not only about the planet's physical changes, but about the ephemeral nature of human systems. A harbor is a conversation between a place and a purpose. When the purpose vanishes, the conversation ends, and the stones are left to whisper to an empty sea. The story of Myos Hormos is a lesson in the fragility of a map. On the wind-swept Egyptian coast of the Red Sea, far from the marble heart of Rome, this port was once a frenetic gateway to unimaginable wealth. For over 2 centuries, it served as the primary launch point for Roman merchant ships bound for India. Each year, a fleet would set sail from its protected lagoon, carrying gold, silver, fine glassware, and wine. Months later, those same ships would return, their holds groaning with the treasures of the East: black pepper, gemstones, silks, and exotic spices. Myos Hormos was more than a dock. It was the sharp end of a commercial spear, a vital artery pumping luxury directly into the empire's economy. Its success depended on a precise and perilous logistical chain. Goods from the Mediterranean would arrive overland from the Nile, cross the desert by camel caravan, and be loaded onto ships waiting in the Red Sea. It was an expensive, arduous route, but for a time it was the only game in town, and the profits were astronomical. Yet its very existence was a precarious gamble, vulnerable not to the sea's depth, but to the shifting calculus of trade. The first challenge came from a rival just a little further south, the port of Berenice. While Myos Hormos had a reasonable natural harbor, it was plagued by notoriously difficult northerly winds that could delay departures for weeks. Berenice, though it lacked a good natural anchorage and required more artificial breakwaters, enjoyed more favorable winds. As Roman maritime technology improved and the imperial administration sought greater efficiency, the balance began to tip. Investment and official preference slowly shifted to Berenice. The government moved its customs and military garrison there, and merchants followed the infrastructure. Myos Hormos did not silt up overnight. It was simply outcompeted by a slightly better option. The flow of commerce, that invisible current that gave the port life, began to divert. Then came a change that would erase it from the map entirely. With the decline of Roman power in the region and the rise of Persian and later Islamic maritime networks, the entire axis of trade between the Mediterranean and India underwent a seismic shift. New, powerful routes through the Persian Gulf, connecting to the caravan cities of Mesopotamia, became dominant. These routes were shorter, safer, and now controlled by emerging political powers who invested in their own ports. The Red Sea corridor, and Myos Hormos with it, was bypassed. The economic reason for its existence vanished. Without the constant traffic of ships and caravans, the maintenance of its breakwaters and buildings ceased. The desert, which had always been held at bay by human activity, began its quiet reclamation. Sand drifted into the empty streets, the wooden piers rotted away. The stone warehouses, once packed with incense and ivory, stood open to the wind. Today, the ruins of Myos Hormos lie silent and inland, stranded in a desolate landscape. This is the key to its story. The harbor is not underwater, it is in the desert. The coastline here has changed very little. The sea did not retreat from the port. Instead, the port was abandoned by the world. Its stones are a monument to economic obsolescence, a stark reminder that a harbor dies when its purpose is forgotten, leaving a skeleton of ambition for the desert sands to bury. But sometimes a harbor's end came not from the earth or the economy, but from a deliberate human hand. Throughout history, these vital gateways were not just centers of trade, they were also prime military targets. To capture or cripple a harbor was to strangle a city's lifeline, to sever its connection to food, wealth, and reinforcements. In times of conflict, the very infrastructure that gave a port its strength could become its greatest vulnerability. A besieging army might not need to storm towering city walls if they could simply break the stone arm that kept the sea at bay. The massive artificial breakwaters, called moles, were feats of engineering that took generations to build. Yet in a single campaign, they could be systematically dismantled. Enemy sappers would row out under cover of darkness, prying at the mortar between the giant blocks, or using fire and vinegar to weaken the stone before hammering it apart. The goal was to open the sheltered basin to the fury of the open sea, making it impossible for ships to anchor safely. Without a functional harbor, a coastal city would wither on the vine, its warehouses full of goods it could no longer export, its people facing hunger as supply ships turned away. In other cases, the destruction was even more total. A conquering force, seeking not just to capture but to erase a rival's power, might order the harbor to be filled in. They would demolish the quays and lighthouse, then dump the rubble into the basin itself, physically plugging the entrance with stone and debris. This was a symbolic act of utter dominance, ensuring the site could never be used as a port again. The message was clear: your time as a gateway is over. Following such a catastrophic event, the choice for survivors was stark. They could attempt the Herculean task of clearing thousands of tons of sunken stone and rebuilding from the seabed up, a process that could take decades and vast resources. Or they could make a clean start. Often, the political landscape had shifted so profoundly that returning to the exact spot held little advantage. A new ruling power might prefer to build a fresh port under its own control, a few miles down the coast, untainted by the memory of defeat and designed for new strategic needs. The old, shattered site would be left as a monument to the conflict, its broken moles slowly succumbing to the waves, a different kind of ruin where the story written in the stones is one of fire, strategy, and the hard calculus of war. So these silent stones are not just monuments to a lost past, they are active crime scenes. An abandoned harbor site is an open history book, its pages made of earth, silt, and rubble. Archaeologists call this stratigraphy, the layered sequence of deposits that builds up over time like a geological layer cake. Each stratum, each distinct band of soil or debris, holds a frozen moment. The key is that these layers are laid down in order, the oldest on the bottom, the youngest on top. By carefully reading this vertical sequence, scientists can reconstruct the precise timeline of a harbor's life and, more importantly, its death. A layer of clean, packed sand might represent the original seafloor, the blank page before construction began. On top of that, you might find a stratum of crushed limestone and pottery shards, the debris from the initial building phase. Then comes a thick layer of rich, dark soil filled with everyday objects, coins, fish hooks, and broken amphorae. This is the Golden Age, centuries of bustling occupation where life flourished. But then the story turns. Above that dark soil, you might encounter a sudden, sterile band of yellow silt, devoid of any human artifacts. This is the river's signature. The moment the harbor began to choke, a season of catastrophic flooding that deposited a thick blanket of mud over the docks and forced a pause in human activity. The next layer might show attempts at recovery, a thin stratum of new gravel laid down as a floor for a repaired wharf, but on top of that more silt and then even more. The human-made layers become thinner, the garbage pits fewer, until finally the sequence ends with a cap of pure, wind-blown sand. That is the final sentence in the harbor's story, the moment the last person left and the desert or the forest began its reclamation. This stratigraphic archive allows researchers to do more than just guess at causes. They can pinpoint them. They can match a layer of tsunami-borne marine sand with historical records of an earthquake. They can analyze pollen grains trapped in a silt layer to determine exactly what crops were being grown upstream when that erosion happened. Each abandoned harbor is therefore a unique environmental recorder, its layers capturing not just human history but planetary history, written in sediment and stone. The stratigraphic record is a meticulous ledger of disaster. To read it is to learn the exact language of destruction, to distinguish between a slow, quiet burial and a sudden, violent end. Each type of event leaves its own unique fingerprint in the earth, a signature written in the size of the grains, the arrangement of the debris, and the very composition of the layer itself. For an archaeologist, these are not just layers of dirt, they are the final pages of a harbor's diary, and the handwriting is unmistakable. Take the process of siltation, the slow killer we've followed. Its signature is one of immense patience. In a harbor basin, you will find a sequence of layers that are remarkably uniform. They are composed of fine, well-sorted particles of clay and silt, laid down in thin, even bands that can stretch for meters in depth. There are no sudden interruptions, no chaotic mixes of material. It is a calm, relentless accumulation, like watching dust settle in a sunbeam, except this dustfall lasted for centuries. Within these fine layers, you might find the occasional lost coin or broken pottery shard, but they are isolated, quiet artifacts sinking slowly through time. This stratigraphy tells a clear story of a harbor gradually becoming shallower, season by flood season, until the water was simply gone. It is the geological record of a long, drawn-out farewell. Now contrast that with the signature of a tsunami. Here, the Earth's ledger records not patience but fury. The layer left by a giant wave is a snapshot of pure chaos. It begins with a sharp, erosional contact, a violent line where the wave scoured away the existing ground surface. On top of that, you find a deposit of sand, but it is not the gentle beach sand of a calm shore. This sand is coarse, often mixed with pebbles and shells ripped from the seabed. And crucially, embedded within this sandy matrix is a jumble of human tragedy and daily life, smashed pottery, fragments of building stone, roof tiles, and even personal items, all tumbled together in a single, catastrophic moment. This is not the slow settling of isolated objects. It is a violent blender of everything the wave picked up as it surged over the harbor front and into the city streets. After the sand layer, there may be a cap of finer silt, representing the calm after the storm as the disturbed sediment in the water column finally settled back down. This distinct triad, scour surface, chaotic sandy debris, settling silt, is the unmistakable fingerprint of a tsunami. It allows researchers to say with confidence that a harbor was not just flooded, but was struck by a specific, high-energy marine event. By carbon dating a shell from that layer or identifying the style of pottery fragments within it, they can often tie the disaster to a known historical earthquake, closing the loop between geological evidence and human memory. These layers do more than explain an abandonment. They freeze the instant of catastrophe, holding the echo of the wave long after the water has receded. These submerged ruins are more than just archaeological sites, they are geological instruments. When a Roman engineer laid the first foundation block for a quay, he was doing more than building a dock, he was setting a permanent benchmark. He needed that surface to be at a precise height, a careful balance above the high tide line to stay dry, yet low enough for ships to easily load and unload. That exact elevation was a calculated decision, frozen in stone. Today, when marine archaeologists map these sunken structures, they are not just cataloging ruins, they are reading a very specific measurement from the past. The depth at which we find that meticulously laid quay surface, that breakwater crest, or those wooden pilings tells a clear story. It reveals the exact change in the relationship between that piece of land and the sea since the moment it was built. Think of it as a tide gauge left running for 2,000 years, but to get the true reading, you must account for local quirks. If the area is known to have subsided, like the land around Portus, you subtract that sinking from the total depth. If tectonic forces have lifted the coast, you adjust for that rise. Once these local movements are calculated, what remains is the change in sea level itself. A quay now 10 feet underwater, in a region that has sunk 2 feet, tells us the sea has risen 8 feet since its construction. This turns every submerged harbor into a data point, a hard number in the grand equation of our planet's changing climate. By collecting these points from different eras and different coastlines, from Bronze Age settlements to medieval ports, scientists can build a curve, a timeline of how quickly or how slowly the oceans have advanced. A harbor abandoned in the 5th century and one drowned in the 15th provide benchmarks that let us model the pace of change across a millennium. This data is invaluable. It helps us reconstruct not just where the coastline was, but what it looked like, which bays were navigable, which river mouths were open, and how the geography of trade and settlement must have functioned. These stone and wood remnants, intended for commerce, have become one of our most reliable sources for understanding the long, slow rhythm of the Earth's transformation. They offer a profound perspective, reminding us that the waters that now conceal these ancient docks are themselves an archive, rising page by page over the sunken libraries of our past. But the clearest witnesses to a harbor's final days are often the ships themselves. When a vessel sank within the sheltered waters of its own port, it became an accidental time capsule, sealed in mud and silence. Unlike a wreck on the open sea scattered by waves, a harbor wreck settles into the basin's soft sediments, preserved in stunning detail. Its very presence there is a clue, and every part of it, from the curve of its hull to the weight of its cargo, tells a specific story about the port that failed to protect it. The design of the ship is the first chapter. A long, slender galley built for speed and manned by oarsmen speaks of a military harbor, a naval base guarding a strategic coast. A broad-beamed, deep-keeled merchant ship, however, tells of commerce, of bulk goods and long-distance trade. The size of the vessel is a direct measurement of the harbor's capabilities. A ship with a draft of 10 feet could only operate in a basin that was at least 12 or 13 feet deep at low tide. Finding such a wreck at a certain location gives archaeologists a precise depth gauge for that exact spot at the moment it sank. But the cargo is where the story comes alive. A hull filled with marble blocks or pre-carved column drums indicates a port under construction, a gateway for monumental architecture. Amphorae stacked to the ceiling, some still containing traces of wine, olive oil, or fish sauce, paint a picture of a bustling economic hub, a place where the necessities and luxuries of an empire were loaded and unloaded. Sometimes the cargo reveals a moment of crisis, a ship found with its hold still full, its valuable goods never retrieved, suggests a sudden, catastrophic event, a storm that overwhelmed the breakwater or a sudden subsidence that dragged the dock under before anyone could react. Most telling of all is the pattern of multiple wrecks. A single sunken ship might be an accident, but a cluster of wrecks, all dating to roughly the same period and found in what is now a shallow, silted area, is a historical alarm bell. It marks the moment the harbor's slow death became a tangible danger. Imagine the scene. As the basin grew shallower from silt, the margin for error vanished. A ship entering port, loaded to capacity, might strike a newly formed mudbank it could have cleared a decade before. A sudden squall could drive a vessel aground where deep water used to be. Each wreck added to the cluster is a failed negotiation with a changing environment. Eventually, the risks became too great, the losses too frequent. The harbor masters would have seen the pattern, the accumulating wooden skeletons in the bay. That cluster of wrecks is the archaeological signature of the final tipping point, the moment the port was no longer a gateway but a trap. These silent ships, therefore, are not just relics, they are the last log entries in a harbor's operational diary, written in oak and cedar instead of ink. The most eloquent witnesses to a harbor's transformation were often the smallest. Beyond the silent stones and sunken ships, a different kind of record lies buried in the mud, one written by creatures that lived and died by the water's minute changes. This is the realm of bioarchaeology, where the shells of mollusks and the glassy skeletons of microscopic life become precise environmental proxies, telling a story of salinity, depth, and purity that no human chronicler ever could. When scientists drill a core sample from a buried harbor basin, they are not just extracting soil, they are pulling up a library of ancient ecosystems, page by slender page. Each layer holds the remains of the organisms that thrived in the water column at that exact moment in time. The key is that every species has its own strict preferences. Some mollusks, like certain clams and oysters, can only live in fully marine conditions with stable, salty water. Others are adapted to brackish environments, where freshwater from a river mixes with the sea. Still others thrive only in the quiet, fresh water of a marsh. By identifying which shells are present in which sediment layer, researchers can chart the harbor's aquatic life with astonishing precision. A layer rich in marine oyster shells tells of a deep, open connection to the sea. Above it, a band dominated by brackish water mussels signals the river's increasing influence as silt begins to constrict the harbor's mouth and dilute the salinity. Finally, a cap of freshwater snail shells is the definitive signature of the end, marking the moment when the basin became a stagnant lagoon cut off from the tides and then a marsh. But the story gets even more detailed when we look closer to the near-invisible. Diatoms are single-celled algae encased in exquisite glass-like shells of silica. Foraminifera are tiny amoebas that build intricate chambers of calcium carbonate. These microorganisms are hypersensitive to their surroundings. Different species are calibrated to specific water depths, temperatures, nutrient levels, and especially salinity. Their preserved shells or tests are so abundant that a single gram of harbor mud can contain thousands of them. By analyzing the diatom and foraminifera communities in each layer of a core, scientists can reconstruct the water conditions almost to the season. They can detect the moment when pollution from the city's tanneries or metal workshops began to alter the ecosystem, seeing a shift from pollution-sensitive species to hardy, tolerant ones. They can pinpoint episodes of increased freshwater inflow that might not have been severe enough to change the mollusk population, but which these microscopic sentinels recorded faithfully. This biological data creates a high-resolution environmental timeline. It allows researchers to distinguish between a harbor that silted up rapidly from a single catastrophic flood, which would show an abrupt shift in species, and one that faded slowly over centuries, which would show a gradual transition in the microfossil community from marine to freshwater types. These tiny, durable shells are therefore more than just fossils. They are the harbor's own water quality reports, its depth soundings, and its pollution logs, all filed away in the sediment by nature itself. They give a voice to the water that once flowed there, telling us not just when the harbor died, but how it felt in its final years. The silent stones of these harbors do not tell a story of passive surrender. Scattered among the ruins, archaeologists find the clear marks of a struggle. the physical evidence of generations who refused to let their lifeline to the sea slip away without a fight. These are the engineering responses, the ingenious and often back-breaking human attempts to hold back the tide, the silt, and the sinking land. They reveal a society that clearly understood the forces arrayed against it and marshaled its collective will and technological skill to resist. Each dredged channel, each extended breakwater, is a monument not to failure but to determined adaptation, marking distinct chapters in a harbor's long battle for survival. The most direct response to the creeping threat of silt was the dredge. While ancient societies lacked our modern machinery, they possessed immense reserves of human and animal labor. The evidence for this constant maintenance is written in the layers of harbor sediment. In cores taken from places like the Roman port of Ostia, researchers find alternating bands, a rhythm of occupation and intervention. A thick layer of fine, undisturbed silt represents a period of neglect, perhaps during a war or economic downturn. But right on top of it, you might find a stratum of mixed, churned-up material containing broken pottery, lost coins, and shells from different depths all jumbled together. This is the signature of dredging. Workers would have used simple buckets, shovels, and drag lines to scoop the muck from the harbor floor, dumping it on land or into deeper water nearby. This redeposited layer, chaotic and full of artifacts from different eras, is the archaeological fingerprint of a community fighting to buy itself more time, season after season, year after year. When dredging the basin was not enough, engineers took the fight to the source. They built structures to intercept the silt before it could reach the precious deep water. At the Roman harbor of Leptis Magna in North Africa, archaeologists have identified the remains of what are believed to be massive silt traps. These were likely long, low walls or dikes built perpendicular to the coast, upstream of the main harbor entrance. Their purpose was strategic, to catch the sediment carried by longshore currents before it could drift into and block the port's mouth. It was a brilliant piece of defensive thinking, creating a sacrificial zone where the land was allowed to build up, protecting the vital channel behind it. Similarly, at many river-mouth harbors, we find evidence of diversion channels and canals. Instead of trying to stop the river's sediment, the goal was to redirect its flow, to shunt the silt-laden water away from the main anchorage and into a secondary basin or marshland. These projects represent a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, an attempt to work with the natural forces rather than against them in a futile head-on collision. Perhaps the most dramatic adaptations are the physical extensions of the harbor itself. As the original coastline silted up or sank, cities did not immediately abandon their entire waterfront. Instead, they built new fingers of stone reaching out toward the retreating deep water. We see this clearly in the layered construction of breakwaters and quays. At sites like Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great, the initial Roman quay can be found buried under later extensions. The original dock, built at what was then the perfect depth, eventually found itself in water too shallow for new, larger ships. So a new quay was constructed directly in front of it, extending the usable waterfront seaward. You can sometimes trace 3 or even 4 phases of this outward march, each new wall a testament to a generation's refusal to give up the fight. The moles, those great protective arms of stone, were also lengthened and reinforced over time, as storms took their toll and as the need to shelter ships in deeper water became more urgent. These engineering projects were not just technical fixes, they were social and economic commitments of staggering scale. Organizing the labor, sourcing the stone and timber, and funding the years of work required a stable, wealthy, and highly centralized authority. The presence of these major adaptations in the archaeological record often correlates with the peak of a city's power during the Pax Romana or the height of a local dynasty. They mark phases of prosperity and confidence, but they also tell a quieter story. Each major renovation, each new seawall, represents a moment of crisis overcome, a recognition that the environment had shifted yet again and demanded a new response. The harbor's life can be read in these pulses of construction, a heartbeat of human ingenuity slowly fading as the challenges grew greater and the resources grew thinner. Ultimately, these magnificent efforts were holding actions. They prolonged the life of the port for decades, sometimes centuries, but they could not change the fundamental geological reality. The final layer of silt, or the ultimate subsidence, would always arrive. The last, unfinished quay extension, its stones neatly laid but never connected to a city, is perhaps the most poignant find of all, a frozen moment of ambition interrupted by the inevitable. These ruins of resistance remind us that the story of ancient harbors is not one of fate, but of dialogue, a long, costly, and ultimately human conversation with a changing world. This long-term struggle against the elements created a distinct and predictable rhythm of urban movement. Rather than vanishing, a maritime city would creep sideways, leaving a trail of abandoned stone along the shoreline like footprints in wet sand. This pattern of incremental relocation is the clearest archaeological signature of a civilization in dialogue with a changing coast. When a harbor's usefulness faded, the response was rarely to abandon the sea entirely, but to shift the point of connection, preserving the community's knowledge, trade networks, and identity while surrendering the specific piece of land to the waves or the silt. We can trace this slow, sidestepping dance in the story of Myos, one of the great intellectual and commercial powers of ancient Ionia. Its original glory was built on 4 magnificent harbors, protected by a labyrinth of islands and peninsulas in the Latmian Gulf. For centuries it was a powerhouse, but the relentless Meander River was at work, pouring silt from the deforested hills of Anatolia into the Gulf. Slowly, inexorably, the open water between the islands filled with mud. The deep harbors grew shallow, then marshy, and finally transformed into solid, mosquito-ridden land. The coastline marched westward, leaving the city's heart stranded. Myos did not die. Instead, it began a long, patient retreat. As each harbor basin silted up, the city's active waterfront would shift to the next available deep water anchorage further along the receding shoreline. Over generations, the center of maritime activity crept like a crab following the retreating sea. What was once the bustling city center became an inland neighborhood, then a forgotten field. New quays were built on the new shoreline, and life continued, adapted to a new but familiar geography. This process repeated for centuries, creating a string of archaeological sites that mark the city's phased withdrawal. Today, the magnificent ruins of classical Myos, including its enormous theater that once looked out over blue water, now gaze across a flat, green plain several miles from the sea. The city's final, smaller harbors were located much further west, clinging to the last vestiges of the Gulf until they too were lost. The story is written in the landscape, a sequence of harbors of different ages, each one a little further from the original city center, tracing the path of a community walking backward into the future, never turning its back on the sea. The same pattern unfolds on a grander, more deliberate scale with the Phoenician city of Tyre. Originally founded on a small, rocky island just off the Levantine coast, its island location was its primary defense, making it nearly impregnable to ancient armies. Its harbors, one facing north and one south, were engineering marvels, but an island has limited space. As Tyre's wealth and population exploded from its famous purple dye and maritime trade, it needed room to grow. The solution was not to abandon the island citadel, but to extend its reach. The Tyrians began a monumental project of land reclamation, building a massive causeway out from the mainland and filling in the shallow seabed to create a sprawling suburban district. This new land became the base for expanded port facilities and a larger population. over time, as the island's original harbors may have faced challenges with silt from the mainland, the focus of maritime activity likely shifted toward these newer mainland extensions. When Alexander the Great famously besieged the city, he conquered it by building his own causeway out to the island, forever joining it to the mainland. This physical connection accelerated the geographical shift. In the centuries that followed, especially under Roman rule, the center of gravity moved decisively. The mainland area, now called Paleotiris, grew into the dominant urban center, while the original island became more of a ceremonial and fortified acropolis. The harbors followed this political and economic shift. Later, after the Arab conquests, a new port was established even further south at a place called Reshaped. The life of Tyre as a port entity did not end in one place, it rippled along the coast. You can walk this history today, from the ancient Egyptian harbor on the island to the massive Roman hippodrome and colonnaded way on the former mainland suburbs, to the later medieval and Ottoman ports. Each site represents a chapter, a new answer to the old problems of space, defense, and access to deep water. The city did not fall, it flowed, adapting its maritime heart to the needs of each new age while leaving a chain of stone witnesses along the shore. This creeping relocation reveals a profound truth about these ancient maritime cultures. Their identity was not rooted in a specific set of coordinates, but in a function, in their role as a gateway. The community, its shipwrights, its merchants, its pilots, and its gods of the sea was the true constant. The stones and docks were simply the current tools. When one set of tools became unusable, they were left behind and new ones were fashioned a little further down the coast. This pattern turns a coastline into a timeline. A series of abandoned harbors, each slightly younger than the last, forms a direct archaeological sequence that charts both a city's persistence and the relentless environmental pressures it faced. It shows us that for these societies, resilience was not about building a wall against the sea, but knowing when to take a step back, to gather their collective memory, and to begin again where the deep water waited. Yet this constant sidestepping dance raises a profound question. Why did some cities, like Portus, eventually leave their stone hearts behind in the fields, while others, like Istanbul or Alexandria, managed to hold their ground for millennia, their harbors pulsing with life in nearly the same spot century after century? The answer lies in a brutal calculus of geography, resources, and sheer human will. It is the difference between a city that was a port and a city that became a portal, a place so strategically vital that abandoning it was simply unthinkable, regardless of the cost. Consider the fate of a city like Ephesus. Its story, as we have seen, is one of magnificent surrender. The Cayster River slowly sealed its harbor with silt, and the coastline marched away. Despite its immense wealth and cultural importance, Ephesus was ultimately a regional capital, a brilliant but replaceable node in a network. When the effort of fighting the river outweighed the benefits of staying, the economic logic failed. The deep water moved, and so, eventually, did the center of gravity. The city's population dwindled, its grand buildings were quarried for stone, and its ruins were left as a stunning monument in the quiet Turkish countryside, a place where tourists now walk where triremes once floated. This is the classic arc of abandonment. The function of the harbor defined the city's life, and when that function vanished, the city itself could not survive in its old form. Now hold that image in your mind and turn your gaze to the Bosphorus. Here sits Istanbul, a city known in succession as Byzantium, Constantinople, and finally Istanbul. This is the ultimate example of a persistent port. For over 2,000 years, its magnificent natural harbor, the Golden Horn, has been one of the busiest waterways on Earth. The geography here is a once-in-a-planet gift, a deep, sheltered inlet that forms a perfect anchorage, fed by freshwater streams and protected from the fierce storms of the Black Sea. But it was not immune to the universal laws of harbors. Silt from those very streams threatened to choke it. The challenges were constant, yet, unlike Ephesus, this city could never be abandoned. Its location was not merely convenient, it was geopolitically sacred, the literal bridge between continents and the strategic choke point between two seas. To control this harbor was to control empires. Therefore, the response to environmental pressure here was not relocation, but relentless, imperial-scale intervention. When silt threatened the Golden Horn, Byzantine and later Ottoman engineers did not simply dredge, they re-engineered the very hydrology. They built massive underground systems to control freshwater runoff and divert sediment. They organized armies of laborers in continuous, costly maintenance campaigns. The wealth of entire provinces was poured into maintaining this single, irreplaceable asset. The harbor was not just a commercial facility, it was the key to the city's defense, its food supply, and its identity as the center of the world. The cost of failure was not a slow decline, but the collapse of an empire. This geographical luck, combined with this unlimited political will to invest, created a kind of immortality. The harbor persisted because the world could not afford to let it die. Alexandria presents a slightly different but equally compelling case of persistence. Its eastern harbor may have succumbed to subsidence, as we have seen, but the city's larger port function never ceased. Why? Because Alexandria possessed a rare combination of a good natural site and an irreplaceable role. It was the primary funnel for the grain of Egypt, the breadbasket of first the Roman and then the Byzantine Empire. When one harbor basin faced problems, the colossal resources of the state were deployed not to abandon the city, but to adapt it. They might shift operations to the western harbor, or build new breakwaters, or initiate yet another heroic dredging project. The investment was astronomical, but the alternative, letting the grain fleet falter, would mean famine and revolt in Rome or Constantinople. The city's function as a vital organ in the imperial body made it too big to fail. Its persistence was a testament to its engineered indispensability. The contrast could not be starker. On one hand, we have the beautiful, silent fields of Ephesus where the harbor's story ended. On the other, the relentless, thunderous activity of Istanbul's Golden Horn, where the same story has been forcibly rewritten every generation for 24 centuries. One speaks to the power of natural forces over human settlement. The other speaks to the power of human necessity over nature. The abandoned cities teach us about adaptation and the limits of a place. The persistent ports teach us about ambition and the limitless will to maintain our idea. They show that a harbor can become more than a location. It can become a destiny, and destinies are fought for with every tool and treasure a civilization can muster. In their endless struggle, we see not just engineering, but the raw expression of a collective refusal to let a particular light go out on the water. The silent stories of these harbors were not lost, only waiting for a new way to listen. For centuries, their secrets lay buried under water and earth, invisible to traditional archaeology. The transformation began not with shovels but with sound. Modern researchers now peer into the deep past using remote sensing technologies that act like medical scanners for the earth, revealing hidden structures and ancient landscapes without ever breaking the surface. One of the most powerful of these tools is side-scan sonar. Towed behind a research vessel, it emits fan-shaped pulses of sound that sweep across the seafloor. The returning echoes paint a detailed acoustic picture, a stark black and white image that shows texture and shape with astonishing clarity. On a monitor, a smooth, muddy bottom appears as a uniform gray. But a line of perfectly aligned, rectangular shadows emerges as the ghostly outline of a sunken breakwater. Scattered, angular blocks resolve into the tumbled remains of a collapsed lighthouse. This technology can map vast areas of seabed, identifying promising ruins for divers to investigate later. turning a blind search into a targeted recovery mission. To see beneath the seafloor itself, scientists use a sub-bottom profiler. This device sends lower-frequency sound pulses that penetrate the layers of sediment, reflecting off different materials and interfaces. The result is a vertical slice, a cross-section of the geological past. On its readout, the clean, hard reflection of the bedrock appears as a strong, continuous line. Above it, the chaotic jumble of a tsunami deposit stands out as a distinct, tangled band. Most tellingly, the slow, uniform accumulation of harbor silt shows up as a stack of fine, parallel lines, a visual record of centuries of quiet deposition. This allows researchers to literally measure the depth of history, to see how many meters of mud separate the modern seabed from the ancient port floor, and to pinpoint exactly where a shipwreck or foundation might be buried within that sequence. From even higher above, satellite imagery and aerial photography provide the grand, strategic view. By analyzing subtle variations in vegetation color or soil moisture, patterns emerge that are invisible on the ground. The faint, straight line of a filled-in canal might cause crops to grow in a slightly different shade of green. The buried outline of an ancient basin can affect how water drains after a rain, leaving a visible trace in the landscape. These tools allow archaeologists to map the paleo coastline, the forgotten shape of the shore as it existed thousands of years ago, revealing where the deep water channels once ran and where the original harbors must have been located. But to read the fine print of the environmental story, you need a physical record. This is where sediment coring becomes revolutionary. Imagine lowering a hollow tube, often no wider than a coffee can, straight down through the layers of a buried harbor basin or a nearby marsh. As it drives into the earth, it captures a continuous cylinder of history, a pristine column of mud, sand, and silt that holds every particle deposited over millennia. When extracted, this core is a time machine in a tube. Researchers split it open lengthwise, revealing a striped catalogue of the past. They can see the abrupt change from marine sand to river silt, the thin layer of volcanic ash from a long-forgotten eruption, the band rich in charcoal from a period of intense human activity. Within this mud, they find the microscopic fossils, the pollen grains, and the chemical signatures that tell the precise story of the water's salinity, the climate, and the human impact. This method is minimally invasive. It leaves the vast majority of the site undisturbed for future generations with better technology, while still providing chapters of data from a single, narrow borehole. Together, these tools have rewritten the field of maritime archaeology. They allow us to move from studying single, spectacular shipwrecks to understanding the entire life cycle of a port, from its birth in a favorable geography to its long struggle against the elements, to its final abandonment and burial. We are no longer just finding ruins, we are diagnosing their history, listening to the echoes of their creation and the whispers of their end in the layers of the earth and the reflections of sound in the deep. These silent archives of silt and stone do more than confirm history, they often correct it. For centuries, our understanding of the past relied on the written word, on chronicles penned by scribes and poets who interpreted events through the lens of politics, morality, or divine will. A harbor's decline was rarely seen as a geological process. It was a symptom of a society's failing virtue or a conqueror's wrath. Modern harbor archaeology acts as a crucial fact-checker for these ancient narratives, separating human interpretation from planetary cause. A powerful example of this correction comes from the eastern Mediterranean, from the once great harbor of Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great. For generations, historians reading later texts believed the port's decline was tied directly to the political turmoil following Herod's death and the eventual Roman suppression of Jewish revolts. The narrative was compelling, a story of a brilliant but tyrannical king's legacy crumbling alongside his dynasty, a moral lesson in stone. The physical evidence, however, tells a different, more patient story. Underwater surveys and sediment cores from the harbor basin reveal a clear environmental timeline. The magnificent breakwaters, engineering marvels of hydraulic concrete, began to fail not from neglect after a political fall, but from a slower, more insidious enemy, seismic activity. The region is crisscrossed with fault lines. Research suggests a series of earthquakes, likely in the 4th and 6th centuries, caused sections of the mole to subside unevenly into the soft seabed. Once the protective arm was broken, the relentless Mediterranean waves began their work, pounding the exposed structures and scattering the giant blocks. Only after this physical collapse did the harbor become difficult to use, accelerating its economic decline. The political changes were a factor, but they were not the primary cause. They were a consequence that compounded a geological reality. The ruins show that the harbor was fighting a battle on two fronts, against human conflict and a shifting earth, and the earth struck the decisive blow. This recalibration is profound. It moves the story from a simple tale of moral decay to a complex interplay of human ambition and planetary force. It suggests that a society did not necessarily abandon a port because it lost its way, but because it lost its fight against a coast that would not stay still. The written record gives us the drama of kings and revolts. The harbor sediment gives us the quiet, decisive tremors that undermined their world. By listening to both, we gain a richer, more humbling understanding of how civilizations truly change, not always by the sword, but often by the slow, unfeeling movement of the ground beneath their feet. This mud is a climate archive. The same sediment layers that chronicle a harbor's slow death hold a far grander record, a meticulous log of the ancient atmosphere and the human hand upon the land. When scientists extract a core from a buried Roman port or a silted medieval dock, they are not just reading local history. They are sampling the environmental memory of an entire region, preserved in the quiet darkness below the waterline. Every particle tells a part of this larger story. Take pollen, for instance. These tiny, nearly indestructible grains are blown by the wind from surrounding forests, fields, and marshes, eventually settling into the calm waters of a harbor basin. Their preservation in the mud is extraordinary. By identifying the types of pollen in each layer, researchers can reconstruct the vegetation that clothed the hillsides in a specific century. A deep layer rich in oak and pine pollen paints a picture of a pristine, forested landscape. A higher stratum showing a sudden spike in olive and cereal grains, however, marks a clear turning point, the moment those forests were cleared for agriculture. The harbor sediment becomes a botanical time capsule, recording the transformation of a wild ecosystem into a human-managed one. Even more telling are the microscopic flecks of charcoal found alongside the pollen. These blackened fragments are the signature of fire. A natural wildfire might leave a faint trace, but a thick, concentrated band of charcoal often points to sustained human activity, the systematic use of fire to clear land for farming or pasture. This combination, a decline in tree pollen and a rise in both crop pollen and charcoal, creates an unmistakable signal in the mud, a direct record of how a civilization reshaped its environment to feed and fuel its growth. The harbor, passively receiving the runoff from the entire watershed, faithfully recorded this transformation, silt grain by silt grain. Beyond these biological markers, the very chemistry of the sediment holds climate secrets. Scientists can analyze the stable isotopes of oxygen trapped within the shells of microscopic creatures or in the layers of silt itself. The ratio of these isotopes acts as a paleothermometer and rain gauge. Certain ratios indicate periods when rainwater was more abundant, suggesting a wetter, stormier climate that would have caused increased erosion and river flooding, which in turn would have dumped more silt into the harbor. Other ratios point to eras of prolonged drought where slower rivers carried less sediment, allowing clearer waters and different ecological conditions to prevail in the port. By reading this isotopic code down the length of a core, researchers can build a timeline of climatic shifts, wet phases, and dry spells that may have lasted for decades. This data connects the local story of a harbor choking on silt to global climate patterns. A period of intense harbor siltation in the Mediterranean might correlate with a known climatic anomaly, like the Roman warm period or the cooler, unstable centuries that followed. It allows us to ask, was this harbor abandoned because of local deforestation alone? Or was it also pushed over the edge by a broader climatic shift that brought heavier, more erosive rains to the region? The harbor sediment provides the ground truth, the local impact of these planetary rhythms. This turns every abandoned port into more than an archaeological site. It becomes a data point in the vast project of paleoclimatology, the study of past climates. While ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica give us a global atmospheric record, and tree rings tell us about regional moisture, harbor sediments offer something uniquely valuable: a dated, continuous record that links human activity with environmental change in the very places where civilizations were most vulnerable. They capture the downstream consequences of both natural climate variation and human choices. A single core from the silted harbor of Ephesus or Portus contains a layered narrative of regional deforestation, agricultural expansion, climatic fluctuations, and engineering response, all bound together in a column of mud. These silent, waterlogged archives remind us that the story of human civilization is inextricably woven into the story of the environment. The harbors that connected the world also collected its history, holding in their deep, stratified silence a record of the air, the forests, and the rains of bygone ages, waiting for us to learn their language. This slow, physical separation from the sea did more than just move buildings. It altered a people's story of themselves. When the deep water that defined a city's purpose and prosperity retreated, leaving its stone heart stranded inland, the event was too profound, too disorienting to be explained by silt alone. The human mind, faced with such a rupture, often wove the raw facts of geology into the richer fabric of myth. A harbor's death by geology could be remembered as a death by divinity, a punishment from the gods for human arrogance. The legend of the city of Helike, which we touched on earlier, is a perfect example. Historically, it was likely destroyed by a massive earthquake and tsunami in 373 BC. But in the stories that circulated for centuries afterward, the disaster was an act of divine wrath. The people of Helike had angered Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, by refusing to surrender a statue of him to a group of visiting ambassadors or by mistreating his priests. In response, the god unleashed his fury, causing the earth to open and the sea to rush in, swallowing the city whole. This mythological framing does something powerful. It gives a chaotic, senseless natural disaster a moral cause and a narrative order. It was not random geology, it was a consequence. The story served as a warning about piety and the limits of human power, transforming a terrifying geological event into a lesson etched into cultural memory. Similarly, the slow silting of a great harbor could be interpreted as a god's gradual turning away. If a river was seen as a deity, as many were, then its action in choking a port could be read as the deity withdrawing its favor, perhaps because of a broken ritual or a forgotten offering. The physical process became a spiritual one, a slow abandonment by the very forces that once nurtured the city. This myth-making was not mere superstition, it was a profound form of sense-making. It allowed a community to process loss, to integrate a catastrophic change into their understanding of how the world works. The myth provided a reason where science at the time could not. But these stories were not only about punishment, they were also about rebirth and the heroic founding of new beginnings. When a community was forced to relocate its harbor, that traumatic journey often became canonized in its foundation legends. The act of following the receding shoreline, of choosing a new spot for the sacred docks, could be retold generations later as the purposeful quest of a hero, guided by an oracle or a divine sign. The messy, economically driven process of moving a few miles down the coast might be remembered as a triumphant founding led by a semi-divine ancestor, cleansing the narrative of its hardship and uncertainty. This reframing served a vital cultural purpose. It legitimized the new settlement, giving it an ancient and heroic pedigree that connected it to the old, hallowed site while asserting its own destined right to exist. The new harbor was not a consolation prize, it was the promised land revealed. In this way, the relentless geological pressure that forced cities to move also forced them to constantly renew and re-narrate their own origins. Each new harbor site came with a refreshed story, a myth that explained why this place, and not the old one, was now the true home. The landscape itself became a palimpsest of these stories, with each abandoned harbor ruin serving as a physical anchor for a tale of divine punishment, and each new bustling port a living testament to a tale of heroic refounding. This intertwining of earth and story shows us that the legacy of these moving harbors is not just written in sediment, but in saga. The silent stones are not just geological data points, they are the forgotten altars of old gods, the sunken stages upon which communities acted out their deepest fears and highest hopes, using the language of myth to speak about the slow, patient power of the planet beneath their feet. The lessons from those sunken stones are not locked in the past. They echo with a pressing, modern urgency. The same forces that strangled ancient harbors are at work today on a global scale, and our great coastal cities now stand where Ephesus and Portus once did, at the edge of a rising sea. The dialogue between human settlement and the dynamic coastline has not ended, it has simply grown louder. We face a triple threat familiar to any Roman engineer, but accelerated by our own actions: relative sea level rise from a warming climate, land subsidence from groundwater extraction, and the sheer weight of our megacities, and the increased ferocity of storms supercharged by warmer ocean waters. The ancient harbors offer us something invaluable. They are long-term case studies. They show us the full arc of a relationship with the coast, from ingenious adaptation to eventual, often reluctant, retreat. They demonstrate that resilience is not about building a permanent wall, but about maintaining the flexibility to change course. The cities that persisted for millennia, like Istanbul, did so through constant, costly, and conscious intervention, a societal commitment to maintain a vital asset against natural forces. The ones that faded, like Myos Hormos, often did so when that commitment wavered, or when the economic or environmental cost of staying simply became too high. Their ruins are not just archaeological sites, they are prototypes of failure and success written in stone and silt. For modern planners, these sites provide a critical perspective. They warn against the illusion of permanence on a fluid boundary. Building ever higher seawalls and levees in sinking deltas is the modern equivalent of the Roman dredge crews at Ephesus, a heroic but potentially endless holding action against a force that may ultimately demand a different strategy. The ancient record suggests that at a certain point, the cost of defense exceeds the value of the land being protected, and the logic of the place shifts. This is the uncomfortable but essential insight from the past. Our challenge is to read these harbors as cautionary tales about unsustainable relationships with the coast. They teach us that the most profound resilience may not always be about staying in place, but about having the foresight to know when and how to make a managed, dignified retreat, to follow the deep water of a sustainable future rather than fighting a doomed battle against an advancing sea. The silent harbors ask us a difficult question: will we learn from their long, layered history, or are we destined to become the next stratum in the sediment, a future ruin for archaeologists to puzzle over? For all we have uncovered, the past holds its silence close. Even with our sonar and sediment cores, some harbors remain stubbornly enigmas, their final chapters missing crucial pages. The precise sequence of events that sealed their fate can be a tangled knot, impossible to fully unravel. Take the grand Minoan port of Amnisos on Crete. We know it was a vital hub for the Bronze Age civilization that thrived there. We also know the cataclysmic eruption of Thera, the volcano we call Santorini, occurred around the year 1600 BC, sending tsunamis across the Aegean. But did those waves directly destroy Amnisos, or did they merely damage it, leaving it vulnerable to a slower death from seismic subsidence or the political collapse that followed the eruption? The sediment might show a layer of tsunami sand, but pinning that layer to a specific season, or disentangling it from later earthquake debris, is a detective story with clues that have faded over 36 centuries. The exact trigger in the chain of disaster remains just out of reach, a reminder that some timelines are written in whispers. Other ports exist only as names in ancient texts, legendary waypoints that have vanished from the map entirely. One of the most tantalizing is the Egyptian port of the Bulls, mentioned in records as a major pharaonic harbor on the Red Sea coast, a launch point for expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt. Scholars have theories about its location, but its physical remains have never been conclusively identified. Was it buried under the relentless sands of the desert, or did a sudden collapse of the coastline plunge it into deep water, hiding it beyond the reach of standard surveys? Its mystery underscores a humbling truth. For every Ephesus we can walk through, there may be a dozen such lost gateways, their stories still folded within the landscape, waiting for a stray satellite image or a farmer's plow to reveal a first clue. Then there are the ghosts of larger catastrophes, events so vast they left only subtle traces. Researchers now suspect the Mediterranean has been struck by mega tsunamis, waves generated by colossal submarine landslides off the coast of Sicily or North Africa, far larger than any triggered by earthquakes alone. The evidence for these is sparse, a suggestive layer of unusual marine sediment found in coastal caves across the sea or enigmatic deposits far inland. If such a wave did sweep across the ancient world, its impact on harbors would have been apocalyptic, not just damaging ports but reconfiguring entire coastlines, perhaps erasing some sites completely. Yet without a clear, datable signature in multiple locations, these events linger in the realm of scientific hypothesis, a shadowy possibility that challenges us to look deeper. This is the enduring nature of the search. Each technological advance does not simply answer old questions, it reveals new layers of mystery. The development of more precise coring techniques might let us analyze annual layers of harbor silt like tree rings, reading not just centuries but specific years of flood and drought. New chemical methods could trace a single silt particle back to the exact mountain valley it eroded from, mapping the human impact on the landscape with impossible precision. Every tool we invent is a new lens, and with each look the silent stones have more to say. The story of ancient harbors is not a puzzle we will one day complete. It is a conversation with the past that grows richer and more complex the more carefully we learn to listen. The restless stones of these harbors tell us one thing above all else: they existed on a frontier. This was not a border between nations, but a far more ancient and volatile line, the shifting seam where the solid earth meets the restless sea. Every harbor was a settlement on that contested edge, a declaration of human ambition on a battlefield of silt, salt, and seismic force. Their constant movement was not a failure of planning, but the inevitable result of building on a line that nature itself refuses to draw permanently. We have seen the evidence: the harbors pushed inland by rivers, pulled under by sinking coasts, and abandoned when the maps of trade were redrawn. Each ruin, therefore, is more than a dead city. It is an active archive, a stone and sediment memory bank that encodes a complex conversation. Within its layers, we can read the patient argument between a river and a coastline, the sudden verdict of a fault line, and the relentless, often unintended, signature of human need. These sites do not merely hold artifacts, they hold dialogues, the entire interplay of geology, climate, and ambition frozen in time. To walk among them is to listen to that conversation, to hear the whispers of engineers arguing with the tide, of merchants pleading with a receding shoreline, of a community's identity slowly adapting to a world in flux. The harbor, in this light, becomes one of humanity's most profound symbols. It represents our eternal desire to connect, to trade, and to build gateways to the wider world. But it also represents the humility forced upon us by a dynamic planet. It is a monument to both our brilliance and our impermanence, a testament to the fact that civilization's greatest structures are not castles on solid rock, but negotiations with a coast that is always, always moving. So the next time you see a modern container port, a sprawling city by the water, or a seaside town, pause for a moment. Look past the steel and concrete to the water's edge itself. That line is not as fixed as it seems. The ancient harbors ask us a final, reflective question. What story will our own coastal infrastructure tell? What layers of concrete and plastic, what shifts in sea level and sediment, will future researchers read in the strata of our seawalls and abandoned neighborhoods? The dialogue between land and water continues, and we are all now writing its next chapter.